Kyle Rivers had always been the kind of person who valued simplicity and solitude. As a freelance photographer, his work kept him busy, but it also allowed him to live life on his own terms. When he finally bought his dream home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, he thought he'd found the perfect place to settle down and focus on his career. The house wasn't huge, but it had charm: a neat front yard, a cozy back patio, and enough space for his photography equipment and editing setup. For Kyle, it was everything he needed. One of the perks of working from home was the freedom to dress as he pleased. Kyle was notorious among his friends for his casual style, often opting for boxer shorts and an old t-shirt, even when he was editing high-profile photo shoots. To him, comfort was key. After all, he wasn't expecting visitors, and his property was private. Or so he thought. It was a warm Saturday morning when Kyle first met Gloria Braxton, his next-door neighbor. She was a petite woman in her 60s with an air of self-importance that immediately filled the space around her. Her neatly styled silver hair, floral print blouse, and perfectly pressed slacks gave her the appearance of someone who believed in order above all else. Kyle was trimming some bushes in his front yard when Gloria approached, a clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. "Good morning," she chirped, though her tone carried more scrutiny than friendliness. Kyle looked up, wiping sweat from his brow, and gave her a polite nod. "Morning. Can I help you with something?" he asked. Gloria's gaze flicked over his outfit, an old tank top and plaid boxers with a barely concealed look of disapproval. She cleared her throat. "I'm Gloria Braxton. I live next door," she said, gesturing toward the house to his left. "I'm also the head of our neighborhood committee. I just wanted to introduce myself and make sure you're aware of our community standards." Kyle raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. "Community standards?" "Yes," Gloria replied, her smile tight. "We take pride in maintaining a certain level of decorum here. It's important for the neighborhood to reflect." Well, a certain image. Her eyes drifted back to his boxers. Kyle chuckled, brushing off the subtle jab. "Well, I'm sure I'll fit in just fine. Thanks for stopping by, Gloria." He turned back to his bushes, hoping to end the conversation, but Gloria lingered. "I noticed you don't have curtains on your front window yet," she continued. "You might want to consider putting some up. Privacy is important, you know." "I'll keep that in mind," Kyle replied, his patience thinning. He didn't appreciate unsolicited advice, especially from someone he'd just met. Gloria finally took the hint and left, but not without a final comment about how she hoped to see him at the next neighborhood meeting. Over the next few days, Kyle tried to forget the awkward encounter. He busied himself with unpacking, setting up his home office, and editing a new batch of client photos. But it wasn't long before Gloria made her presence known again. This time she knocked on his door, clipboard in hand, and informed him that his trash cans were placed too close to the curb and needed to be moved back by at least 3 feet. Kyle nodded politely, though he couldn't help but roll his eyes as soon as she turned to leave. It wasn't until a week later that things took a more confrontational turn. Kyle was outside watering his lawn in his usual attire, boxers and a loose t-shirt, when he heard a loud gasp from across the yard. He turned to see Gloria standing at her mailbox, staring at him with a look of utter horror. "Excuse me," she called out, marching toward him with a speed that belied her age. Kyle stopped what he was doing, confused. "Yes?" he asked. "This is unacceptable," Gloria exclaimed, gesturing wildly at his clothes. "You can't just parade around like that where everyone can see you." Kyle blinked, caught off guard by her outburst. "I'm on my property," he said slowly. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Gloria crossed her arms, her face reddening. "There are children in this neighborhood, Mr. Rivers. What kind of example are you setting?" Kyle sighed, trying to keep his cool. "With all due respect, Gloria, I'm just watering my lawn. If you don't like what I'm wearing, you don't have to look." Gloria's mouth opened and closed as if searching for a retort, but all she managed was a sharp, "This isn't over." She stormed back to her house, leaving Kyle standing there, bewildered. He didn't think much of the encounter at first. People like Gloria existed in every neighborhood. He figured busybodies who thrived on creating drama out of nothing. But over the next few days, Kyle began to notice subtle signs that Gloria's disapproval had escalated into something more concerning. It started with the overturned trash cans. At first, Kyle thought it might have been raccoons, but the neat way the lids were placed beside the bins made him suspicious. Then there were the footprints in his flour, too large to belong to an animal, and too fresh to be old. Finally, he caught a glimpse of Gloria standing at the edge of her yard one evening, her arms crossed as she watched him through narrowed eyes. Kyle decided it was time to set some boundaries. The next time he saw Gloria, he planned to have a polite but firm conversation about leaving him alone. But before he could, things took a darker turn. One morning, as Kyle stepped outside to grab his mail, he found a handwritten note taped to his door. "Your behavior is inappropriate and reflects poorly on our neighborhood. Consider this a warning." Kyle stared at the note, a knot forming in his stomach. This was no longer just an overbearing neighbor making snide comments. Gloria was actively targeting him, and he had no idea how far she was willing to go. Kyle tossed the handwritten note onto his kitchen counter, pacing back and forth as he tried to process what had just happened. A warning? From Gloria? He couldn't believe the audacity. She wasn't just nosy, this was harassment. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Kyle felt genuine unease. Was this how things were going to be from now on? Constant passive-aggressive notes and strange looks from across the yard. Determined not to let her intimidate him, Kyle decided to ignore the message. He wouldn't give Gloria the satisfaction of knowing she had gotten under his skin. Instead, he spent the rest of the morning editing photos and trying to focus on his work. But even as he adjusted lighting and cropped images, he couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. That evening, as Kyle sat on his back patio enjoying a cold beer, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head quickly, but all he saw was the rustling of bushes along the edge of his property. At first, he thought it might be a squirrel or a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. His heart began to race. "Hello," he called out, standing up and walking toward the noise. He peered into the darkness, but the bushes remained still. Kyle shook his head and muttered to himself, "Get a grip, man. It's probably nothing." Still, the strange noise left him feeling unsettled, and he decided to call it a night. The next morning, just as Kyle was starting to think things might calm down, the situation escalated. A loud knock on his door jolted him from his seat. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the urgency of the knock immediately put him on edge. When he opened the door, he found 2 police officers standing on his porch. "Good morning, sir," one of them said, his tone professional but firm. "We received a complaint about a disturbance on your property." Kyle frowned, confused. "A disturbance? What kind of disturbance?" The second officer glanced at his notepad. "Your neighbor reported inappropriate behavior visible from the street. She described it as indecent exposure." Kyle's jaw dropped. "You've got to be kidding me. I was in my own yard wearing boxers and a t-shirt. That's hardly indecent." The first officer raised his hands in a calming gesture. "We're just here to follow up on the complaint, sir. Can you confirm you weren't doing anything that could be considered inappropriate?" Kyle rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. "I was watering my lawn. That's it. Nothing inappropriate, nothing indecent. I don't know what she's talking about." The officers exchanged a glance. "All right," the second officer said. "It sounds like there's been a misunderstanding. We'll note that in our report, but we need to remind you to be mindful of how your actions might be perceived in a neighborhood like this." Kyle couldn't believe what he was hearing. Perceived? I'm on my property. Since when is that a crime? The officers didn't respond directly, instead thanking him for his time and leaving. As their patrol car pulled away, Kyle stood in his doorway, his mind racing. This wasn't just an overreaction from Gloria, it was a deliberate attempt to weaponize the authorities against him. That afternoon, Kyle decided it was time to take action. He installed a security camera above his front door, angling it to cover both his yard and the street. If Gloria was going to keep harassing him, he wanted proof. For a few days, things seemed to quiet down. Gloria stayed out of sight, and Kyle began to hope that the visit from the police had satisfied her need for drama. But just as he started to relax, the situation took another turn. It was late in the evening when Kyle heard a loud crash outside. He rushed to his front window and saw that his trash cans had been knocked over again, but this time the mess was much worse. Garbage was strewn across his driveway, and the lids were nowhere to be seen. Kyle's first instinct was to check his security camera footage. When he reviewed the recording, he didn't see raccoons or any other animals. It was Gloria. She had marched over to his driveway just after dusk, kicked the trash cans over with surprising force for someone her age, and then casually walked back to her house. Kyle felt his hands clench into fists. This was no longer passive-aggressive behavior, this was outright vandalism. Kyle debated whether to confront her directly or involve the police, but he ultimately decided to give her the benefit of the doubt one last time. The next morning he knocked on her door, trying to keep his frustration in check. Gloria opened the door, her face lighting up with a fake smile. "Oh, Mr. Rivers, what can I do for you?" Kyle forced a polite tone. "I'd like to talk to you about my trash cans. I saw what happened last night." Gloria's smile didn't falter. "I don't know what you're talking about." Kyle pulled out his phone, ready to show her the footage. "You kicked them over. It's all on camera." For a split second, something flickered in Gloria's eyes, fear, perhaps, or anger. But she quickly regained her composure. "I was simply trying to make a point, Mr. Rivers. Your trash cans were an eyesore, left too close to the curb. I was doing you a favor." Kyle's patience snapped. "A favor? You scattered garbage all over my driveway. If you have a problem, talk to me about it. Don't sneak around at night and vandalize my property." Gloria's smile turned icy. "I see you're not interested in being a good neighbor, Mr. Rivers." "That's unfortunate." She closed the door in his face before he could respond. As Kyle walked back to his house, he felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Gloria wasn't just a meddling neighbor, she was malicious. He knew he needed to take the situation more seriously, but he wasn't sure where to start. That evening, as Kyle was reviewing more footage from his cameras, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Gloria wasn't just watching him from her yard, she had been walking around the perimeter of his property at night, sometimes for several minutes at a time. In one clip, she stopped to peer through his kitchen window, her face illuminated by the faint glow of his porch light. Kyle realized this wasn't just a neighborly dispute anymore. Gloria's behavior was invasive, and it was escalating. He decided to call his lawyer the next day to find out what his options were. But before he could, Gloria struck again. Early the next morning, Kyle woke to the sound of loud banging on his front door. He stumbled out of bed, still groggy, and opened the door to find Gloria standing there, red-faced and shouting. "How dare you ignore my warnings?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "This is my community, and I won't let you ruin it." Kyle stared at her, stunned. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she snapped. "Your indecency, your lack of respect, your refusal to follow the rules." Kyle took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Gloria, I'm not breaking any rules. I'm minding my own business. You need to leave me alone." Her expression darkened. "You think you can just dismiss me like that? You'll regret this, Mr. Rivers. Mark my words." With that, she stormed off, leaving Kyle standing in his doorway, more determined than ever to put an end to her harassment. Kyle sat at his kitchen table, his coffee untouched as he scrolled through footage from his security cameras. Every moment he reviewed deepened his frustration and unease. Gloria's behavior wasn't just irritating anymore, it was obsessive. The image of her standing at the edge of his yard at night, peering into his windows, was burned into his mind. What had started as petty complaints and passive-aggressive notes had evolved into full-blown stalking. He knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. The next morning, Kyle called a local lawyer specializing in property and harassment disputes. After explaining the situation, the lawyer, a calm but firm man named Ethan Grant, agreed to meet with him the following day. Kyle felt a flicker of hope, at least now he had a professional on his side. In the meantime, Kyle decided to keep a low profile. He avoided spending time in his front yard and kept his blinds closed whenever possible. But even in his own home, he couldn't fully relax. Every creak of the floorboards and shadow outside his window made his heart race. He hated the feeling of being trapped in his own house, but until he had a legal solution, he knew confronting Gloria directly would only escalate things further. Unfortunately, Gloria wasn't content to let things simmer. That evening, Kyle heard a loud crash from his backyard. Rushing outside, he found his patio furniture overturned, the glass table shattered into countless pieces. His stomach churned as he scanned the yard for any sign of an intruder. Gloria, he muttered under his breath. He didn't have proof yet, but he didn't need it. Who else would go to such lengths? Returning inside, he pulled up the footage from his backyard camera. Sure enough, there she was. Gloria had crept into his yard under the cover of darkness, her face barely visible under the hood of a jacket. She spent several minutes examining his patio, then suddenly grabbed the edge of the table and flipped it over with surprising force. After a moment of staring at the mess she'd created, she calmly walked back toward her house, disappearing into the night. Kyle clenched his fists. This was no longer a matter of irritating notes or overturned trash cans, this was vandalism. He immediately called the police, explaining what had happened and offering to provide the camera footage as evidence. When the officers arrived, they reviewed the recording and agreed it was enough to justify speaking with Gloria. Kyle watched from his living room window as the officers knocked on her door. Gloria answered, looking every bit the picture of innocence. From what Kyle could see, she greeted the officers with a warm smile and even invited them inside. He couldn't hear their conversation, but after about 10 minutes, the officers returned to his house. Mr. Rivers, one of them said, shifting uncomfortably, "We spoke with Ms. Braxton and she claims she was never on your property. She says you must have mistaken her for someone else." Kyle stared at them in disbelief. "Mistaken? I have her on camera." The officer nodded. "We reviewed the footage again, but it's hard to make a positive identification. The hood obscures her face, and without a clear view, it's her word against yours. Unfortunately, that's not enough to press charges." Kyle felt his frustration boil over. "So she can just keep doing this? I have to wait until she destroys more of my property or worse." "I understand your frustration," the officer replied. "We recommend filing a restraining order. It might not stop her immediately, but it creates a legal barrier that could help in the long run." Kyle bit back a sarcastic comment and nodded. "Fine, I'll do that." The next morning, Kyle met with Ethan Grant at his office. After detailing everything that had happened, Kyle handed over the videos, photos, and notes he'd collected as evidence. Ethan listened attentively, occasionally jotting down notes on a legal pad. "You're doing the right thing by documenting everything," Ethan said when Kyle finished. "The more evidence we have, the stronger your case will be. I'll start drafting a restraining order immediately. In the meantime, I suggest you continue gathering footage and avoid any direct confrontation with her." Kyle sighed. "That's easier said than done. She's practically stalking me." "I understand," Ethan said, his tone reassuring. "We'll take this one step at a time. For now, focus on protecting yourself and your property. If she escalates again, call the police immediately." Feeling slightly more optimistic, Kyle returned home and spent the rest of the day installing additional cameras around his property. He placed one overlooking the side yard, another near the back gate, and a third inside his house, pointed at the front door. If Gloria tried anything else, he'd have every angle covered. But as the days passed, Gloria's behavior only grew more erratic. One evening, as Kyle sat in his living room editing photos, he heard the unmistakable sound of someone tapping on his window. He froze, his heart pounding, before slowly turning his head toward the noise. Through the sheer curtains, he could make out a vague silhouette. Summoning his courage, Kyle grabbed a flashlight and yanked the curtains aside. The beam of light caught Gloria mid-stride as she hurried away from the window, a smug grin on her face. Kyle threw open the window and shouted, "Stay off my property." Gloria didn't even flinch. She turned to face him, her expression calm but her eyes glinting with malice. "You don't belong here, Mr. Rivers. You'll see that soon enough." Before Kyle could respond, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving him shaking with anger and fear. The next morning, Kyle received a letter from Gloria, delivered not through the mailbox but slid under his front door. The envelope was unmarked, and the letter inside was written in bold, blocky handwriting. You have until the end of the month to leave. This is your final warning. Kyle stared at the note, his hands trembling. It was clear now that Gloria wasn't just trying to annoy him, she was trying to drive him out of the neighborhood entirely. Determined not to let her win, Kyle called Ethan again and updated him on the situation. Ethan assured him that the restraining order would be filed by the end of the week, and that they could use the letter as additional evidence of harassment. But before they could move forward, Gloria struck again. Late one night, Kyle woke to the sound of shattering glass. He bolted out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat he kept by his nightstand, and rushed into the living room. One of his windows was broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. Outside, he could see a dark figure retreating into the shadows. Kyle didn't hesitate. He called the police and waited, bat in hand, until they arrived. This time, the officers seemed to take the situation more seriously. They documented the damage and promised to increase patrols in the area. Still, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse. Gloria was relentless, and he had no idea how far she was willing to go. As he boarded up the broken window that night, he made a silent vow no matter what it took, he wouldn't let her force him out of his own home. Kyle sat at his dining table, staring at the growing pile of evidence he had collected over the past few weeks. Surveillance footage, photographs, copies of the threatening notes, all of it painted a picture of Gloria's escalating obsession. Despite the restraining order Ethan had filed on his behalf, Gloria showed no signs of backing down. If anything, her harassment was becoming more calculated. Kyle was exhausted, both physically and mentally. Every sound outside made him jump, and every glance out the window felt like an invitation for her to find new ways to provoke him. He was on edge constantly, and he hated that she'd managed to disrupt his life so thoroughly. It wasn't just the property damage or the broken window. It was the psychological toll Gloria's presence had turned his home, the place he had dreamed of owning, into a battleground. The restraining order had been officially approved earlier in the week, and Kyle took some comfort in knowing there was now a legal barrier in place. But he also knew it wouldn't stop her. Gloria wasn't someone who played by the rules. She'd already ignored every warning from the police, and Kyle doubted a court order would make much difference. A knock on the door startled him, and his heart leaped into his throat. He froze for a moment, gripping the edge of the table, before slowly standing and walking to the door. Peering through the peephole, he was relieved to see Ethan standing on the porch, holding a folder under one arm. Kyle opened the door quickly. "Hey, come in." Ethan stepped inside, glancing around as if expecting to find Gloria lurking in the shadows. "I wanted to go over a few things with you," he said, setting the folder on the table. "And I wanted to see how you're holding up." Kyle shrugged, running a hand through his hair. "I'm managing." "Barely. She broke one of my windows last week, and I keep hearing noises outside at night. I'm jumping at shadows at this point." Ethan nodded sympathetically. "I don't blame you. People like her thrive on intimidation. It's their way of controlling others. But the good news is, we're starting to build a solid case. The restraining order is a step in the right direction, and if she violates it, we'll have even more leverage against her." Kyle sighed. "I appreciate everything you're doing, but it feels like it's not enough. She's still out there watching, waiting. I don't even know what her endgame is. Does she just want me to leave, or is it something worse?" Ethan hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "It's hard to say. People like Gloria can be unpredictable, especially when they feel their control is being challenged. But that's why it's so important to document everything. If she steps out of line again, we'll have all the evidence we need to hold her accountable." Kyle nodded, though the reassurance felt hollow. "So what's the next step?" Ethan opened the folder and slid a sheet of paper across the table. "I've drafted a formal complaint that we can file with the local council. It outlines her behavior and requests an investigation into her actions. If the council takes it seriously, they might issue her a formal warning or even impose penalties." Kyle scanned the document, his eyes narrowing. "Do you think they'll actually do anything? She's been in this neighborhood a lot longer than I have. For all I know, they'll just brush it off." It's possible, Ethan admitted. But it's worth a shot. The more pressure we put on her, the more likely she is to slip up. And if she retaliates, it'll only strengthen your case. Kyle signed the document without hesitation. He was tired of feeling helpless, and if this was another tool to fight back, he wasn't going to pass it up. Later that evening, Kyle double-checked the locks on all his doors and windows before settling into his living room. He tried to focus on editing a batch of photos for a client, but his mind kept drifting back to Gloria. What was she doing now? Was she lurking outside, waiting for the right moment to strike again? The sound of shattering glass jolted him out of his thoughts. He jumped to his feet, his pulse racing as he grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the couch. His eyes darted to the security monitor on the wall, and he quickly flipped through the camera feeds. In the backyard, Gloria stood near his patio, holding a rock in one hand. The window nearest to her had been smashed, shards of glass glittering on the ground. Kyle's blood boiled. This time she hadn't even tried to hide her actions. She was daring him to confront her. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, keeping his eyes on the screen as Gloria paced back and forth, muttering to herself. "She's broken another window," Kyle told the dispatcher, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and adrenaline. "She's in my backyard right now. Please send someone quickly." The dispatcher assured him that officers were on their way. Kyle stayed on the line, his grip on the bat tightening as he watched Gloria. She suddenly stopped pacing and turned to face the camera directly, her eyes locking onto the lens. A cold smile spread across her face, sending a chill down Kyle's spine. By the time the police arrived, Gloria was gone. Kyle showed them the footage, but just like before, they seemed hesitant to take decisive action. "She's in clear violation of the restraining order," Kyle argued, his frustration mounting. "What more do you need to arrest her?" One of the officers, a weary-looking man in his 40s, sighed. "We'll file a report and forward it to the court. They may issue a warrant for her arrest, but that's up to the judge. For now, we recommend staying vigilant and keeping your doors locked." Kyle wanted to scream. Vigilant? Locked doors? It wasn't enough. Gloria was escalating, and he had no doubt she would strike again. The next day, Ethan called with an update. The counsel had received their complaint and agreed to open an inquiry into Gloria's behavior. It wasn't much, but it was something. That night, Kyle heard footsteps on his roof. He grabbed his phone and immediately checked the cameras. Gloria wasn't on the roof, but she was at the side of the house, holding a long stick with something attached to the end of it. She was using it to try and knock out one of his cameras. Kyle called the police again, his voice tight with anger. "She's trying to destroy my cameras now. I have her on video again. You need to do something." This time, when the officers arrived, they found Gloria still on Kyle's property. She claimed she was chasing a stray cat and accused Kyle of making false accusations against her. But the footage didn't lie. It clearly showed her deliberately tampering with the camera. The officers issued her a citation and warned her that any further violations would result in her arrest. As they escorted Gloria back to her house, Kyle stood on his porch, watching. Gloria glanced over her shoulder and met his gaze, her expression dark and menacing. "You won't win," she hissed. "I'll make sure of it." Kyle's stomach twisted, but he refused to look away. He had no idea how far Gloria was willing to go, but one thing was certain: this was far from over. Kyle was running out of patience. Gloria's threats and harassment had crossed every possible line, and while the restraining order was in place, it hadn't stopped her for even a moment. The footage of her smashing his windows and attempting to knock out his security cameras had finally forced the police to take action, but even then, she was only issued a citation. Kyle knew it wasn't enough. The way she had looked at him as the police led her back to her house like a predator sizing up its prey sent a clear message. Gloria wasn't done. That night, Kyle stayed awake until well past midnight, sitting in his darkened living room with his security feeds pulled up on his laptop. The cameras had been his lifeline, his only solid evidence against Gloria, and he wasn't about to let her destroy them. He kept his baseball bat within reach, his nerves fraying as every small creak of the house set him on edge. At 2 a.m., the motion sensor in his backyard triggered. The monitor lit up, and Kyle leaned forward, his heart pounding. This time it wasn't Gloria. It was two figures, both dressed in dark clothing, moving toward the back fence. They were carrying what looked like tools, a crowbar and a large pair of bolt cutters. Kyle's stomach sank. His hand shook as he dialed 911, whispering into the phone to avoid drawing attention. There are two people in my backyard dressed in black, carrying tools. I think they're trying to break in. Please send officers immediately. The dispatcher assured him that help was on the way, but Kyle didn't feel reassured. He stayed glued to the screen, watching as the two figures worked together to pry open a section of his fence. When the opening was large enough for them to squeeze through, they entered his yard and began walking toward the patio. Kyle couldn't wait any longer. He activated the floodlights, and the yard lit up like a stadium. The intruders froze, momentarily blinded by the sudden brightness. Kyle stepped out onto his back porch, holding the baseball bat in one hand and his phone in the other. "Get off my property," he shouted, his voice trembling but firm. The intruders exchanged a glance, then bolted back toward the fence. Kyle kept the lights on, watching as they scrambled through the opening they'd made and disappeared into the shadows. Moments later, the sound of a police siren cut through the night. By the time the officers arrived, the intruders were long gone. Kyle showed them the footage, and the lead officer frowned as he watched the figures breach the fence. "Do you have any idea who they might be?" he asked. Kyle hesitated. No, he admitted, though he had his suspicions. This wasn't a random burglary attempt. It felt too deliberate, too targeted. Gloria's involvement wasn't something he could prove, but deep down he knew she was behind this. The officer nodded. "We'll file a report and increase patrols in the area. In the meantime, I suggest reinforcing your fence and installing additional security measures." Kyle barely slept that night. The idea that Gloria might be escalating her campaign of harassment by involving others was almost too much to bear. If she was willing to send people onto his property in the middle of the night, what else was she capable of? The next morning, Kyle called Ethan to update him on the situation. "This is getting out of hand," Kyle said, his voice tight with frustration. "She's not just harassing me anymore, she's sending people to my house. I can't keep living like this." Ethan's tone was calm but serious. "I understand, Kyle. This is a significant escalation, and it strengthens our case. The footage of the intruders, combined with Gloria's previous violations, will make it much harder for her to claim innocence. I'll file an emergency motion to bring this to the court's attention. In the meantime, you need to prioritize your safety. Do you have anyone who can stay with you?" Kyle shook his head, even though Ethan couldn't see him. "No, it's just me." "Then you need to stay vigilant. Keep your cameras running, and don't hesitate to call the police if anything else happens." Kyle spent the rest of the day reinforcing his fence and installing more cameras. He even added motion sensors along the perimeter of his property, programmed to send alerts directly to his phone. It wasn't much, but it was all he could do to feel even a little bit safer. That evening, Kyle decided to take a break from his paranoia. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat on the back porch, trying to enjoy the cool night air. But as he stared out at the yard, his mind kept returning to Gloria. What was her endgame? Why was she so hell-bent on making his life miserable? His thoughts were interrupted by a strange noise, a low, scraping sound coming from the side of the house. Kyle's pulse quickened as he grabbed his phone and opened the security app. The side yard camera showed Gloria standing near the wall, holding a bucket of paint. "What the hell is she doing now?" Kyle muttered. He switched to the live feed just in time to see Gloria dip a brush into the bucket and begin painting large, bold letters across his siding. His jaw tightened as he read the words forming on the screen, "Get out." Kyle didn't hesitate. He called the police, his voice tight with anger as he explained what was happening. "She's on my property again, vandalizing my house. You need to send someone now." This time the officers arrived quickly. Gloria was still in the middle of her makeshift protest when they pulled up, their flashing lights illuminating the yard. She turned to face them, her expression defiant. "I have every right to protect this neighborhood," she declared as the officers approached her. "He doesn't belong here." The officers weren't having it. They handcuffed Gloria and led her to their patrol car as Kyle watched from the porch, his hands shaking with a mix of relief and adrenaline. After the officers left, Kyle stared at the words scrawled across his wall, the paint dripping down in uneven streaks. It would take hours to clean up, but for the first time in weeks he felt a glimmer of hope. Gloria had finally been arrested, but even as he started scrubbing the paint away, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Gloria's hatred for him ran deep, and he doubted a single night in jail would be enough to stop her. She had crossed every line imaginable, and he knew she wouldn't give up easily. As he worked, Kyle made a silent vow. No matter what Gloria did next, he wouldn't let her win. This was his home, and he wasn't going anywhere. Kyle had hoped Gloria's arrest would finally bring him some peace, but the silence that followed felt more like the calm before a storm. After spending a single night in jail, Gloria had been released the next day, and though she wasn't back in her usual spot glaring at him from her yard, Kyle knew better than to think she'd given up. Her obsession ran too deep, and he doubted she was the type to let the police or anyone else stand in her way. For a few days, nothing happened. Kyle kept himself busy, using the time to repaint the vandalized siding of his house and patch up the holes in his fence. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was the little things, the creak of the floorboards late at night, the faint sound of footsteps on the sidewalk outside, the way shadows seemed to linger just a little too long. Then, late one night, Kyle was jolted awake by the piercing wail of his security alarm. Heart pounding, he grabbed the baseball bat from beside his bed and bolted downstairs, the sound of the alarm ringing in his ears. The control panel on the wall indicated a breach in the backyard. He opened the security app on his phone and pulled up the live feed. What he saw made his blood run cold. Gloria was back, and she wasn't alone. Two men in dark clothing stood behind her, their faces obscured by hoods. One held a crowbar, while the other carried what looked like a gas canister. Gloria, meanwhile, was holding a stack of papers in one hand and a lighter in the other. Kyle's stomach dropped as he realized what she was about to do. She wasn't just here to vandalize his property, she was planning to burn it down. Without wasting another second, Kyle called 911. His voice shook as he explained the situation to the dispatcher, begging them to send officers immediately. "She's in my backyard with two other people. They're trying to set my house on fire. Please hurry." While waiting for the police to arrive, Kyle stayed glued to his security feed. Gloria was pacing back and forth, waving the papers in the air as she ranted to the two men. Though the audio on the cameras wasn't clear, Kyle could make out snippets of her words. "He doesn't deserve this house. This is for the good of the neighborhood. We'll make sure he's gone for good." The man with the gas canister began pouring liquid along the base of Kyle's back fence, while the other used the crowbar to pry loose a section of the gate. Gloria held the lighter in her hand, flicking it on and off as if testing the flame. Kyle's hands trembled with a mix of rage and fear. He knew he couldn't confront them alone. There were three of them, and they were armed, but he also couldn't just stand by and watch as they destroyed his home. Gripping the bat tightly, he opened the back door just enough to shout, "The police are on their way. Get off my property now." Gloria froze, her head snapping toward the sound of his voice. For a moment she looked almost startled, but then a twisted smile spread across her face. "You think I'm afraid of the police?" she called back. "They won't do anything. You don't belong here, Kyle. This is my neighborhood, and I'm taking it back." Before Kyle could respond, the two men turned and started walking toward the house, their movements slow and deliberate. Kyle backed up, locking the door behind him as they approached. He could hear the sound of their footsteps on the porch and the metallic clang of the crowbar as one of them tried to pry open the door. Then, in the distance, came the sound of sirens. The men froze, glancing at each other nervously. "We need to go," one of them said, his voice low and urgent. Gloria, however, was undeterred. "No," she snapped. "We finished now." She stepped forward, raising the lighter toward the papers in her hand. The sirens grew louder, and red and blue lights flashed across the yard as the police arrived. Officers poured out of their vehicles, shouting commands for Gloria and the men to drop what they were holding and get on the ground. The two men immediately complied, dropping their tools and lying face down in the grass. But Gloria refused. "You can't stop me," she screamed, holding the lighter closer to the papers. "This is justice. He doesn't belong here." One of the officers stepped forward, his hand on his holstered taser. "Ma'am, put the lighter down now or we will use force." For a tense moment it seemed like Gloria might actually follow through with her threat. But as the officers closed in on her, she hesitated, her hand trembling. Finally, with a frustrated scream, she dropped the lighter and sank to her knees. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing all three intruders and leading them to the patrol cars. Kyle watched from the safety of his living room, his heart still racing as he replayed the events in his mind. He had come within moments of losing everything: his home, his work, his sense of safety, all because of one unhinged neighbor's obsession. As the police secured the scene, one of the officers approached Kyle's door. Kyle stepped outside, still gripping the bat, and took a deep breath. "Is everyone okay?" the officer asked. Kyle nodded shakily. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just shaken up." "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to provide a full statement," the officer said. "But for now, I'd recommend staying somewhere else for the night. We'll have a patrol car stationed outside, but just to be safe." Kyle glanced back at his house, his home, the place he'd worked so hard to build for himself. It didn't feel like home anymore, not after everything that had happened. But he wasn't going to let Gloria win. "No," he said firmly. "I'm staying. This is my house, and I'm not letting her take it from me." The officer nodded, a look of respect flashing across his face. "All right, we'll make sure you're safe." As the patrol cars pulled away, Kyle locked up the house and sat down on the couch, exhausted but resolute. Gloria's reign of terror had finally come to an end, and though it would take time to feel normal again, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going anywhere. The morning after Gloria's arrest, Kyle woke up to a strange, unfamiliar sensation: silence. No sounds of someone prowling around his property, no knocking on windows, no alarms blaring in the middle of the night. For the first time in weeks, the air around his home felt calm. But the weight of the previous night's events still hung heavy over him. Gloria's desperate attempt to burn down his house had been a terrifying reminder of just how far she was willing to go, and though she was now in custody, Kyle knew he wouldn't feel truly at ease until the situation was fully resolved. By mid-morning, his lawyer Ethan called with an update. They've officially charged Gloria with multiple counts, including vandalism, trespassing, and attempted arson, Ethan said. "She's looking at some serious consequences, especially with the restraining order violations and the video evidence we've compiled." Kyle exhaled, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. "Does that mean she won't be coming back?" "For now, no," Ethan assured him. "The judge has denied her bail, given the severity of her actions and the risk of her continuing to harass you. The two men she brought with her are also facing charges. Though it seems they were hired to intimidate you and didn't fully understand what they were getting into. That works in your favor, it weakens her defense." Kyle nodded, pacing his living room as Ethan continued. "This is the beginning of the end for her, Kyle. It'll take time, but we've got everything we need to make sure she's held accountable." For the first time in weeks, Kyle felt a glimmer of hope. Gloria was finally facing the consequences of her actions, and he could start to rebuild the peace she had taken from him. Over the next few days, the neighborhood began to react to the news of Gloria's arrest. At first, some of the neighbors seemed hesitant to get involved, unsure whether to believe the rumors. But as more details surfaced: Kyle's video evidence, police reports, and Gloria's history of harassment, it became clear that she had been terrorizing others in the community as well. One afternoon, Kyle was surprised when a neighbor he barely knew, an older man named Ted, knocked on his door. Ted looked sheepish, holding a box of cookies in one hand. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Ted said, shifting uncomfortably. "A lot of us knew Gloria could be difficult, but we didn't realize how bad it had gotten. If we'd spoken up sooner, maybe this wouldn't have gone so far." Kyle shook his head, managing a small smile. "It's not your fault. She had everyone fooled. But thanks for saying that. It means a lot." Ted nodded and handed Kyle the cookies. If you need anything help fixing the fence, repainting, whatever, just let me know. You shouldn't have to handle this alone." In the days that followed, several other neighbors approached Kyle with similar apologies and offers of help. It was a strange but welcome change. For weeks, Kyle had felt like an outsider in his own neighborhood, targeted and isolated by Gloria's campaign of harassment. Now he was starting to feel like part of a community. With their support, Kyle began repairing the damage Gloria had caused. The shattered windows were replaced, the fence was reinforced, and the walls were repainted. He even decided to upgrade his security system one last time, ensuring that nothing like this could happen again. When the time came to testify against Gloria in court, Kyle was ready. He recounted every incident in painstaking detail, presenting the mountain of evidence he and Ethan had compiled. Gloria, seated at the defense table, glared at him throughout the proceedings, but her once confident demeanor had crumbled. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict guilty on all counts. After the trial, Gloria was sentenced to prison, and her property was put up for sale to cover restitution costs. The neighborhood, once ruled by her iron grip of intimidation, began to breathe again. Months later, as the dust settled, Kyle hosted a small gathering at his home to celebrate the end of the ordeal. Neighbors who had once avoided him now mingled in his backyard, sharing stories and laughter. The fence, now freshly painted, bore no traces of the damage Gloria had caused. As the evening wound down, Kyle stood on the patio, looking out over the yard that had once felt like a battlefield. It was quiet now, peaceful. He hadn't just reclaimed his home, he'd reclaimed his life. Gloria's words from that fateful night echoed in his mind, "You won't win." But she had been wrong. He had won, and the house, his sanctuary, stood as proof of his resilience. Kyle took a deep breath, savoring the stillness, and smiled. This was his home, and no one would ever take it from him again.